we have in substance all of our gears. Okay, and in my case, you can't really see it too good, but there's a piece of glass over the front of this too. Yeah, you can't really see it, but it's there. Okay, so we need to get this out and bring it into Maya. Now, on our first assignment, it was no big deal. We had one item, one texture, so it worked out perfectly. With this one, we don't have one item and one texture. We have a bunch of items, and if I zoom out here, still thinking. We have all those different UV tiles, right? Because we wanted to make sure we had a nice crisp texture on that, and the only way to do that is to have a bunch of tiles. We can see it better if I open it up in Maya. So we're going to set my project here to gear, and then go to open, and then open up my gear textures. Okay. Okay, so I have all of these different UV layouts. Now, it would work if I made a brand new surface material or Arnold standard surface for each one of those items and drug their specific file on their specific items. It would work. There wouldn't be an issue with that. But obviously, the time involved in doing that per tile is insane. And then if I change settings on one, I have to go back and change settings on all of them. So that's a huge hassle to do. So we want to make sure that's as quick as possible, as fluid as possible, okay? So what I'm going to do is my first step is to go through and make sure that all my texture sizes are the highest that they can be, okay? So typically I'll do 4096 on those. You can also set this specific one in your export settings, okay? So if this one you don't set to the right setting, you can always change that later. These ones down here, these bake textures, these ones you have to make sure that you set it before you leave, before you start exporting. So remember, you can set it to 4096, and then you can say bake all texture sets, and it'll go through and bake every one of the texture sets, okay? So you don't have to click on each one individually. Mine are still low on some, just so you can see the process. All right, so then what I'm going to do is go to export. And before, what we did is we picked just a random one. It wasn't random. We picked a default configuration one, and that seemed to work out fine. What we need to do now, though, is be a little bit more specific as to what we're going to use. Okay, if we're exporting out, how many of these do I have? 12, I think. 5, 10, 12, yes. If we're exporting out 12 different textures, we don't want to export out anything more than what we need. Okay. So what I like to do is I like to look at my maps and see what's actually there. So if I come over to this area after I close this, and I hit the C key, I can see, okay, this has metallic, right? And I know that in Arnold, there's a spot to punch in metallic where that goes. I see there's an opacity. I have glass on this one, so I know there's a spot for opacity. I know my gears don't have opacity, so I actually may export the glass one out separate, just because there's not really a point of exporting opacity for all of these for just one object. Here's my regular normal. There's nothing on it. I wouldn't do that. Here's my normal height and base. Oh, I should have something there. Hold on. I'll get back to that in a second. Here's my base color, and then here's my height. All right, so my normal map must have just been really subtle. I couldn't see it. There's my roughness. Yep, it was. I just couldn't see it from that angle. Okay, so I do have some normal information that I will be exporting out. I do have base color that I will be exporting out, because that's where most of my stuff's going to come from. I do have the height map I don't use. The roughness I do use. Metallic I do use. Okay, so I'm going to go back to export. And obviously, if it helps you, write it down. So I know roughness, metallic, normal, and diffuse / color, because it's the same thing. Okay, those are the 4 maps basically I want for this entire thing. So if I go to my configuration tab, this is where it's going to show me all of these different configurations. Okay, now this looks like crazy how they have it set up, but don't worry about it. if you right click on one that you want, you can always just duplicate it and then delete stuff, and that makes it 10 times easier than creating your own. So the Arnold 5 one, come on, make it bigger. All right, I can't make it bigger. But this one here where it says Arnold 5 UDIM, I'm pretty sure you have that one there. If not, I'll just make sure we fix it. Yeah. So I want to take this one, and I'm just going to right click and duplicate it and then rename it. No, that's not what I clicked on. Duplicate, yes. And then I'll just rename this Arnold. All right, so I know that one's Arnold. So whenever we do this, just like when we render outside of Maya, render from Maya into anything else, we have a name.number.extension, right? That's something that we've already come into. So this one is $mesh underscore base color dot $ texture set, okay? Now what that means is it's going to take this, let's say 1013, because I'm on 1013, okay? So for this specific map here, this is my base color. So it's going to export it out, whatever the mesh is called, that's what the $mesh means, underscore base color. It's going to put a period, and then it's going to put the texture set. And the texture set is this, okay? It's a location of where each one of these items is placed on this UV layout, okay? Now that's important because it needs to know where are you actually located. So if you don't have that one, you can copy any one of these and just make sure that that has that same thing in there, okay? This here is actually what's going to output. So anything that says RGB is going to be red, green, blue. Anything that says grayscale is just going to be a black and white value. Some of these are RGB and alpha, so you can see that. And this is grayscale, and this is RGB and alpha, okay? So I don't need this emissive one. That's not something I need, so I can just say close. I don't need the height map. I could use that too with a bump, but I don't need it. I said I needed 4 maps, right? Roughness, metallic, normal, and diffuse. Roughness, metallic, or metalness, normal, and base color, diffuse, okay? So these are the 4 maps that I need. So my Arnold one, now that's all set up. It's awesome. So now we go back to export. We go back to here. I go back to pick Arnold. There you is. Yeah, I don't think you do have that UDIM one. You just have to copy this one and then just put in that texture set thing in a different way. So just so you can see it. You would just go like this. Cut that out of there. Put a period. Paste it in. Get rid of the underscore. Okay, and you just do that for each one of these ones that you have. Okay, I already did that to mine, that's why it's there. Okay, so now I have Arnold. I'm going to go through, I'm going to say, okay, I want all of these, and I want them all to be 4096. So I can go through and click 4096 on all those. 1021 or 2. Let me see which one that is. 1021. Okay, so 1021 is my glass. I still need some of these, but not all of them, so I'm just going to export all of them. It's not a huge deal. So then I would click this, and it would say export, and it would export out all these maps at 4K for each one of those maps. So each one of these is producing 4 4K images. The folder size is going to be huge, but it's also going to take maybe 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how many gears you have, depending on how much other stuff you got going on. So just let it do its thing. Just hit the button, let it go. If you're not sure if you're getting out what you want, then you can say none, grab one of these and export out just that one, make sure it's what you want, and then go back and export all of them out, okay? Because if you do it for 20 minutes and then it's wrong, you gotta do it for another 20 minutes, it's wrong again, another 20 minutes, wrong again, take forever. All right, so, perfect. So, what you should end up with when you leave that, and I put them inside my source images, and I made a folder called Gear Textures. I think it's just my backup. Yeah, it's my backup. Okay. What you should end up in here is, I saved them as pings. You could have saved them as targas. Either one would work. Type. There we go. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 21, 22. So notice how it says the name of the item, underscore dist underscore base color. Okay. So gear underscore dist is the name of my file. The underscore base color is the name of the channel it's exporting. And then the .1001 is the location for each one of those things. So I have that for base color. For in this case, I did height also, metalness, and normal, and roughness. Okay. So then what I can do is I come into here, whatever software this is, I'm just going to throw these on a layer just so I don't accidentally select stuff that I don't want to select at the moment. There we go. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is just assign to everything one AI standard surface. Okay. So that standard surface right now is on everything. Gearbox. I go to color. I go to file. I go to folder. Because I set my project, it jumps me right into gear. So make sure that you're jumping right into your project. I'm going to go to my folder here, and I'm going to pick on my very first image. Now remember, when you do bring an image into Arnold and you render it for the first time, it converts it into a TEX file or TX file. So that's why I have a TX there, because I hit the render button after I've imported these already, and it knows to do that. Okay. So I'm going to hit 6 so that I can see my texture. Okay. Now, it looks like there is obviously a texture on here, but it looks horrible. Okay. Right now, it's taking that first image, 1001, and applying it across the board to every single one of my pieces. So if I move this aside, you'll see how it's applying this to all of these pieces. Now, there's only one piece or two pieces inside my thing that actually works on. The rest of them are off. So this is where we have to tell it to use all the other ones. So back on here, I'm going to turn this filter type to off. And then I'm going to say UV tiling mode, set it to UDIM Mari. And what this does is it actually uses that number sequence at the end to figure out which number that goes to. Okay, so I click that. You can set this to whatever you want. I just leave it at high quality. It seems to be fine. And then you say generate preview. So now it's going to use those, and it'll show you the preview of what each of those should look like. So now after I click that button, I should see my textures on there the correct way. If I move these aside, there's my textures. Now ignore some of these are black. I think my normals must be flipped. But all my textures seem to be working correctly. Okay. So then I can just go back to this and do the same thing. I know my weight here has to be up, so I'll put that up. I'll go to metalness. I'll click on file. I'll click on folder. I'll find metalness in here. I'm going to use the TX this time just because when it converts it, like I said, takes a minute. It goes crazy again. We set it to UDIM. Generate preview. Set this to off. Let me jump back to here real quick so we can take a look at this and see. Remember, base color is an RGB that gets exported. The roughness is a black and white grayscale image. The metallic is a black and white grayscale image. So when we have those black and white values, I have to come down here to effect color balance and say alpha is luminance. Okay, that way it reads that black and white as a value. Okay, otherwise it's just going to ignore it and not use that at all. We also have roughness. There we go. File. And this again is a black and white image, so I have to make sure that I click on that button. TX. Set this to UDIM. Set this to off. Generate preview. And alpha is luminance. Okay. And then finally I have my normal map, geometry, bump mapping, file. Set this to tangent space normal. And then this one is a red, green, blue image, so I don't need to set up any other button. I can just bring it in like that. Okay. So now, because of the complexity of all the stuff that I just brought in, your textures may not display at all, or they may look kind of funky. We don't care what it looks like inside the viewport. We care what it looks like when we hit the render button, okay? So for my scene that I created, just so I have some good lighting, I used 2 area lights, each side, one on each side. My intensity I cranked up, my exposure I put up a little bit. I changed them both to disk. I think that's all I did on each light. I think this one may be a little bit lower. Nope, they're actually the same. Okay. And then I have a sphere sky dome light just to help give me some reflections in there. And I believe I mapped that mountain valley environment to it. But I used the blurry one, so it wasn't like crisp reflections. It was just kind of like softer reflections around it. Okay, that's all I did to those. Now, this is a piece of glass. Set that aside for a second. Just so I can see my gears. I want to hit the Arnold renderer. There we go. Alright, now we may hit a point where this part goes incredibly slow. Especially when we have however many 4K textures that we brought in. This part may go super duper slow. So you may want to, I don't think it's in here, I'm just double checking. Yep, no. Wait, was there? Nope. So you may want to go to the Maya render view, which is this little eyeball one, and set the test resolution to something lower than full size. So if I'm going 960 by 540, I may want to set this to 50%. And then inside here, when I reopen that Arnold one, it should give this, yeah, it's a real size now, a smaller size. Nope, it isn't. Why didn't you do that? I may have to render an image first before it does that. Test 50, yes. Or maybe that was. It just looked really big. Okay, so it was smaller. It just looked bigger on my screen. Okay, so it looks pretty horrible, but that's fine. All we're doing now is kind of troubleshooting and tweaking things. Okay. So here's my piece of glass. Now, in order for anything to look like glass, this is going to have some other options assigned to it. Okay. On anything that's glass, I'm just going to assign a, for now anyway, a standard surface. I typically like to break things up into what kind of materials they are. Okay. If I have a bunch of items that are plastic, they'll get one material, metal will get something else, glass will get something else. It just makes it easier for settings, okay, because glass may have different properties than the other ones. So with this piece of glass here, I have to make sure that under my sphere shape, or whatever it's called, under the Arnold area, that this is set to opaque being off. This is probably the stupidest button I've ever seen, but it makes no sense. Okay, so this is opaque, and then that is not opaque. You can see that this didn't change anything at all, right? I'm going to leave it on. I'm going to go to my standard surface. I'm just going to set this to glass, regular glass. Okay, so now you can see kind of through it, and then once I set this to opaque being off, now it's like even better glass. So I don't know why they even have this button. Like, I set it to glass, whatever. Okay. Sweet. So set that back in there. Okay. Now remember too that you can actually take your lights and you can turn off certain features. Like if I don't want this light reflecting right here, I could turn that specular off. Or I can turn it down so it's not as like crisp. So it's not like I'm missing my stuff there. There you go, that works. Okay. I could also go to this item here and under my transmission under my opacity, I can take this down even further. There we go. Okay. And then I can come in here and assign all my maps to it. So I would just go to File. I would go to Normal. And this one is 21. I know that because of where the UVs are and where the other stuff is. So I would just go to that normal map for 21 and just load this one specifically right to it. So there's 21s. I'll set that to be off. And then I'll go back to my color. Something is clicked on. Is it because I clicked that? It's odd. Well, whatever. I'll go to roughness. I'll go to file. I'll find the roughness for that specific piece of glass. Number 21 again. There it is. I'll set this to off. I'll set this to alpha's luminance. And now it'll be using that. Now, I actually need to come back into Substance at some point. My glass really didn't have a whole lot of texture to it. I go back to my base here. You can see that there's not a whole lot of detail on that piece of glass itself. So actually I'm going to come back at some point and just tweak that up a bit. Okay. You can tweak some of the other settings, like you can play with the IOR and that'll control some of the reflective properties. Again, if you're not 100% sure of what they're going to do by going up or down any of these, Arnold 5. That's the version we're on, is Arnold 5. Okay, so here is the specular weight. That's what that's going to do. Here's the 0, 0.5, and 1. The IOR. There it is. 1, 1.1, 1.5. You can see how you're getting more of that reflection throughout the entire thing. Here on the edges, it's the same. It's a little bit more here, and then it's even more vibrant here, and then obviously coming up through the middle. Okay, and then this is also what it's doing with that specific thing. Anisotropy is a cool effect because you can get these kinds of effects with that. Or these kinds of effects with anisotropy where it's like coming down the edge. It's not just reflecting here, it's actually like streaking down the metal, which is awesome. Same thing there. Okay, you can rotate it, whatever. So I definitely want to play with some of my settings and start tweaking some of this. Again, with the Arnold renderer, you can really just go crazy and just start playing with stuff and just see what it's going to look like. Just mess around with some of the settings and then see what the rendering looks like. And because I'm doing this to one item, it's doing it to actually all the items, not just one. I'll put a clear coat on it. How about that? Sweet. Okay. So once you get this from Substance into Maya, you got the texture on there, you got some lights in the scene. It's looking pretty good. Then you're going to render it out. And you're going to render this at that same setting we did before, which is 3000 by 2400 or 2400 by 3000, whichever way your gears seem to fit better. I actually have my settings down a bit. Yes, I do. Under my system, I changed this to -3. That's why my rendering looked pretty horrible. Let me just set this to something more reasonable for a second. I guess that's fine. Let's just see. Okay, so I'm still rendering out at half resolution because it's set up inside my Maya view. But this being at -3, my edges are incredibly blocky. As this comes up, that's going to start to clear up a lot of those edges more. Also under my Arnold renderer, I would crank up some of these settings too as what I'm using. So if I'm getting a lot of that stair-stepping still, I could crank this up some, initial sampling level, or I could crank this up some. Okay, again, you have to give it time because it's still kind of chugging along. Once I get to the point where it's done and I'm happy, I go to File, Save Image, and I save it out. Okay? And that's it. Yes. I don't think we have anything else inside the scene. Nope. Yep, we'll get into other stuff later. Okay? Any questions on finishing up the gear? Yes, ma'am. In substance? Where are we at? 21, there you are. So in here, whenever you did, I'll show, when you do file new, I'll just save this real quick. And I believe you already had this part set up, but just for everyone else who wants to see that part. It has to save everything. This file has got to be huge because of how long it is taking to render or to save. .3 gigabytes of memory. It's more than what I'm using. I wonder if I can open a second substance painter. Maybe I can. Yes, continuing. The bottom middle button when you go to bake. I'm going to say bake all textures or just bake the one. Alright. So, I'm just going to bring in my basic one just so it's a simpler scene. I'll just bring in the high-res cube, that's fine. So, initially we went to this one, which is the metalness, roughness HQ. If you have transparency, you want to also bring in the alpha. That way you have transparency available to you. That should be fine there. Okay. Alright, so now what that should give you is over here on the side, it gives you a new channel. So you'll see that now I have an opacity channel that I didn't have before. Now, just so you can see this, because people will freak out if they want to do it after the fact. This. Okay, so I just set up the default one that doesn't have the opacity. You can just go here and say, I want to add opacity. Okay, you can even add things like index of refraction. You can even add emissive. So if you wanted something to glow, you can have it glowing. Or you can just have some random things you may want to add in here. All right, so let me just bake this real quick. Bake. Yes. Yes. So much simpler when our object was basically a cube. Alright, so remember, all that does is just give us these basic maps that it uses to create textures. So if I hit B, There's a normal map, there's the world space, there's ID, there's ambient occlusion, curvature, position, thickness, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Whenever we drop these on here, these smart materials, a lot of these don't take into account the fact that we do have something like opacity that we may want to tweak. So just as an example, I'll drop this onto that. And what it does is it connects everything pertinent to that specific material that it already created. So to see that, I'm going to hit C, and there's my base color. Hit C again, there's the height, there's the roughness, there's metallic, there's normal. Here's my opacity. You'll see it's checkerboard, meaning there's nothing on it, okay? So up top here, this is where you can actually go into each one of those and paint those specifically if you wanted to paint or see one of those specifically. Now, you don't have to do it from there. Let's say that I want to paint or adjust or do something to opacity itself. I can make a brand new paint layer. There we go. Right here, and over on this side, this is where you're controlling what actually gets painted on that layer. So if I just want to paint opacity, I can just turn all of this off. And actually, I think I'll paint color and opacity. Why not? So right now my opacity is set to 1. 1 opacity is fully opaque. Transparent with 0 opacity. It may take a few times around the block to remember those. So that's what this is going to do, is it's going to make this fully opaque. And the color for this is going to be red. Sure. Okay. So now if I go to C, you'll see that my opacity is black because it just filled in all of that color with blackness. Now in order to paint specifically on that or adjust what that looks like, that's where we would then use a mask. So I could throw in a black mask here, and then on this black mask I could go to brushes, I could go to Sharpie, sure, and then start painting in white on the mask. So now what I'm painting here is that transparency. Now we're not seeing it as transparent because it just doesn't update it like that. But I believe if I go to, not that. Oh, there it is. If I go in here, we can actually see that it is transparent. Like we're kind of seeing through that area. Now it still has the other maps on there, so just because I painted color and I painted transparency, it still has height. It still has all the other stuff. So if I was going to do that, I have to make sure I blacked out all the height, blacked out the roughness, or whatever I'm doing. Okay, and then when we take this into, I guess I should also paint, let's say, at 50% here. There we go. If we take this into Photoshop now, we would get an image that is black here and then this color there. Okay, I should probably have even underneath this a solid white layer of just opacity, just so we get something in there that's consistent. There we go. Okay, so that'll be my opacity map. So then when I bring that into Maya, then I would have the full opaque and then a half. Yes, sir. Right? Right, so we would see through that object. No, it would be basically, like, let's say I put the transparency back here, okay, and I'm just going to grab these faces as an example. That's what we would see, just in this, inside there. If we had, like, let's say a glass, and we wanted it to look like it's glass, we would have to give it the thickness of the glass around it. We couldn't model it paper thin and expect it to look like a thick glass. Okay, same thing with windows. Typically you want to have the thickness of those windows there for that to work. Okay, so that's opacity, and like I said, you could add anything inside this list. Oops. Oh, where did my list go? Scroll up, there it is. Okay, so you could add stuff like emissive, and then that is just a new one. So now I hit C, and there's the emissive one. That's what that looks like. And then I can go and paint. You can still do a regular, just so you're aware of it, you can do a regular layer like this. And I can paint on that layer. But the idea with doing a fill layer than using a mask is that when you do size it up, the fill layer sizes up accordingly. This wouldn't. This would actually get pixelated as it stretches up. Okay? You might notice it, you might not, but that's typically the workflow. Also, all of these ones that they have here where they're using different patterns, those automatically scale up because it's all vector based. It's all like built into the system. Whenever you do regular strokes, those aren't built into the system. Let me go to emission on here, and emissive color, we'll just set this to red. Ooh, it's glowy. And then I'm going to take the roughness down, the metallic down, the height down, base color black. There we go. That's so fancy, isn't it? And then when we come into here, I mean, we're not getting any crazy glowing because it's not really meant to be doing that, but we can kind of see how bright it is at least. Okay? But then in Maya, we could actually use that as a way to light our object if we wanted to. Sweet. Disgustingly ugly, but it works. All right, anything else? All right.